Okay, welcome everybody. Pleased to have everybody here in the room, and folks at home, just to let you know, there's about 75 people attending the talk right now between the in-person and the online. So welcome to this special event. This is part of the Chair in Transgender Studies, and you've just seen a little video about what we do. My name is Aaron DeVore, and I am the founder of the Chair in Transgender Studies, also the Transgender Archives, and the Moving Trans History Forward conferences. So we're at UVic, and we like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen speaking peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The Chair in Transgender Studies is the only research chair. We don't have a department of transgender studies giving out degrees, and just for your information, there are no such departments anywhere in the world at this point. So that's something we can look forward to. But this is a research chair, and we work to provide inspiration and hope to trans plus people, so all different kinds of trans people and our allies everywhere. We contribute to development and communication of accurate, research-based, real-world knowledge about trans plus people that we hope will be used and can be used to build better policies and laws and to drive social change. We also help to build strong and resilient trans plus social and cultural communities and individual well-being by facilitating arts, cultural and social activities. And in all that we do, we are committed to applying an intersectional lens in our work to advance reconciliation, racial justice, equity, and inclusion for all. In addition to events like today's, we also provide leadership in many other services and activities. Again, you saw some of it go by on the video. That includes the world's largest transgender archives, the interdisciplinary, international, and intergenerational biennial Moving Trans History Forward conferences, a variety of scholarships for UVic students and fellowships for visitors to UVic, and also arts and cultural events. Okay, so that's all my introductory remarks before the main event, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker. Dr. Julia Sinclair-Palm is an associate professor in childhood and youth studies in the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies at Carleton University. In their work, they examine how young people forge new identities, imagine futures, and navigate structural inequalities in the midst of larger and sometimes restrictive narratives about childhood and youth. The name of the talk is "What Does It Mean to Protect Trans Children?" Exploring debates about the figure of the trans child, a very contemporary debate and question. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Julia Sinclair.
Hi, it's so nice to be here and to see all of your faces. This is one of the first in-person talks I've done in a while, so it's really nice to see folks. So as Aaron mentioned, my name is Julia Sinclair-Palm, and I teach in the Childhood Youth Studies program at Carleton University. I came to this field through a master's in sexuality studies and a PhD in education. And this interdisciplinary history has shaped how I think about the lives of young people and the figure of the child. My research considers how conceptualizations of childhood and youth are tied to concerns about violence, risk, and mental health, often at the exclusion of other more complex narratives of identity, gender, and belonging. In one of my research projects, I talked to trans youth in Canada, Australia, and Ireland about how they chose their name. For this international project, I turned to trans youth and their stories of renaming themselves to explore how these narratives about the names they receive, refuse, and choose expose the challenges trans youth face when narrating their identity formation and the brilliant strategies trans youth use to navigate cisnormativity. By listening to the stories trans youth tell about their naming process, educators, policymakers, and researchers can better comprehend the supports trans youth may need while opening up spaces for more complex understandings of trans lives. I'll return to some of the findings from the study at the end of the talk. The other project I'll mention briefly today is a project about family. That is just so cute. And I'm doing with my colleague Hannah Dyer at Brock University. Drawing queer and trans family, understanding kinship through children's art elicits and exhibits art from children between the ages of 6 to 12 with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, two-spirit, and queer parents. And this project generates an aesthetic archive of LGBTQ plus kinship. In practice, what this looks like is sitting down with kids who are 6 to 12 years old and asking them to draw a picture of their family and then talking to them about their drawing and what family means to them. We also then hold an exhibit of their art and bring all the families and communities together, and it's just wonderful. This study just got some new funding, and so we'll be heading to Montreal and Vancouver and Edmonton in the coming years. In today's talk, I'm particularly interested in how social and political debates about the child impact the real lives of trans kids. I explore how the figure of the trans child is discussed in these debates and draw on trans studies, childhood news studies, and my research with trans youth to think about what we can learn from this current moment. To think about what we can learn from this current moment. I ask, what does this attention on the figure of the trans child tell us about the state of trans studies and childhood youth studies? How are trans youth navigating cisnormativity and debates about their existence? I argue that trans children's ability to articulate their needs and advocate for their rights reminds us that all children have agency and self-determination. I also look to trans youth practices of choosing a new name to highlight narratives of trans joy and resistance to cisnormativity. Sweet. I'll give you a sense of what I'll be discussing today. Here's a little bit of an overview of the points I want to cover. First, I'm going to discuss the current state of anti-trans legislation in Canada, which is terrible, and how the figure of the child is being used in these debates. In my analysis, I consider the increased visibility of trans kids and draw on the construction of childhood and the concept of innocence to explore how the language of protection functions in these debates. I conclude my talk by taking a close look at some of the ways trans youth demonstrate their agency, creativity, and expert knowledge of their lives through the process of choosing a name. So trans rights are clearly under attack in Canada, and kids are often the target of this new anti-trans legislation. Trans kids were at the heart of many of the debates in BC and Ontario regarding the sex ed curriculum. Childhood innocence was used as a strategy to argue that kids aren't ready to learn about gender and sexuality at particular ages, and that kids should only learn about that information from their parents. The impact of using this rhetoric of innocence is that information about gender and the existence of trans people is coded as dangerous in interruption to innocence. So much more has continued to shift over the summer. So in July, Alberta's premier took a photo at the Calgary Stampede event with a man wearing a straight pride shirt. Also in July of this year, a Calgary MP was pictured with 2 men wearing shirts depicting a family being sheltered from the rainbow, followed by the words, "Leave our kids alone." In the last month, policies in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan have been proposed that will require parental consent for students under 16 to change their pronouns and or their first name. The policies encourage teachers to out their students to families who may cause them harm or disown them. These policies are similar to those being proposed and passed in the US. They're being driven by a number of beliefs, one being that parents know what is best for their child and that parents have rights. Underlying these political shifts in the US and Canada is the desire to erase trans people. Just this last week, Conservatives voted to outlaw trans lives as part of their platform. They voted for a motion that stated children should be prohibited from gender-related, quote, life-altering medicinal or surgical interventions, which will limit access to transgender healthcare for minors. CBC reported that Michelle Baldich, an Edmonton delegate, said dysphoria is, quote, a mental health disorder, and it should be addressed with treatment, not, quote, irreversible procedures. And to a thunderous applause, she said, "Please protect our kids." In a speech about another policy that is intended to keep transgender and other gender diverse people out of women's prisons, shelters, locker rooms, and washrooms, she said, "It's not extremist to demand that what we call biological women have a space to call their own." In support of Baldach, a 15-year-old delegate from Sherwood Park urged delegates to, quote, vote yes to protect your wives and daughters. The strategies being used for transphobic aims are right out of the homophobia playbook from 50 years ago. For example, in 1977, Anita Bryant was part of a campaign to limit the legal rights of LGBTQ people. She was opposing a recent ordinance in Florida that had granted gay people housing and employment protections. Bryant argued that parental rights were being denied. and Bryant took the idea of protecting children and made it mainstream. Her campaign and the subsequent Save Our Children political coalition used the argument that homosexuals, this is a quote, homosexuals cannot reproduce, so they must recruit. And to freshen their ranks, they must recruit the youth of America. Much of this rhetoric has continued to be repeated, and this notion of protecting children remains one of the Republicans' main strategies. Some Christians believe that parental rights are given to them by God and are rights that cannot be given or taken away by a government. They argue that it is the government's job to recognize and uphold these inherent rights. Mike Ferris is most known as the leader of the Christian homeschooling movement, which sought to legalize homeschooling. But in the 80s and 90s in the US, he was the main voice of parental rights. Ferris created the advocacy organization parentalrights.org and lobbied for a constitutional amendment asserting that, quote, the liberty of parents to direct the upbringing, education, and care of their children is a fundamental right. The history of parental rights in Western society has roots in Christianity, homophobic and transphobic rhetoric, and the need to keep children innocent by protecting them from dangerous knowledge from people. The thing is, parents don't have rights. They have responsibilities. When parental rights are invoked, they're almost always talking about their child's access to healthcare, services, and knowledge. The political strategy of using parental rights or childhood innocence to push for a conservative agenda puts children in the middle of these debates, further denying their rights, agency, and voice. The push for parental rights often arises in regards to conversations about sexuality and gender in schools. The idea of parental rights is used by conservatives as a strategy to limit the scope of conversations that schools might have with young people about sexuality and gender. Similar to the way protection is invoked in discussions about the child, parental rights are also used to limit young people's agency, self-determination, voice, and right to access information about sexuality and gender. Young people are dehumanized when adults insist that they know what is best for the child, and when parent rights are prioritized over child rights. So I'm interested in how the language of protection is being used in these debates about trans rights and the figure of the child. I don't know about you, but when I first came out to my parents, they were worried. They were scared that life would be hard for me. They thought it would be harder for me to find someone who would love me, that finding a job might be more difficult, and that I would be bullied at school. They even worried about how my imagined children wouldn't have a male role model or a father figure. That one still makes me chuckle. But that initial worry is something that I come back to when I think about trans youth today. My parents really thought my life would be easier if I was straight and cisgender. They wished I could change my mind. They wanted to rescue me, but I wasn't asking to be saved. I didn't come out to them because I wanted their help or permission. I already knew what I needed. I think a lot of parents act from this place of worry. They want the best for their kid and don't know what to do or how to be a parent in the face of this news. Parents may find that their child feels strange to them, that they have become something unknown. They don't know who their kid is anymore, and yet they don't know who their kid is anymore. And yet for many kids, they don't feel like they've changed. Maybe this fear parents have leads them to a desire to save their child from transness. Parents sometimes feel like they don't know how to protect their kid anymore. Parents are told by the state that their job is to protect their child. And with this news, their kid might be trans, they are at risk of failing in their job as a parent. The language and strategy of protection comes up most when we are afraid. For some parents, there are real consequences when the state thinks you are not doing your job to protect your child. The rhetoric of protection justifies the forced removal of Native children from their homes in order to provide the, quote, appropriate conditions of childhood. This is often framed as a historical issue, but there are more Indigenous kids in the foster system in Canada today than there ever were in so-called residential schools. The language of protection is also used by the state and the media to perpetuate stereotypes about Black mothers, poor mothers, and disabled mothers as morally deficient and harmful to the child. The state, with the rationalization that they are acting in the best interest of the child, uses the idea of protection and childhood innocence to, quote, save children and to mold them into the image of the white middle-class child. The language of protection is used by all arms of the state, whether it be the criminal justice system, education, or social work, to reinforce white supremacy. Children are seen as property of the state, and as objects, they have no agency and no rights. language of protection isn't just used by conservatives and Republicans. It's also being used by trans advocates and allies. A common message of support at marches and rallies is protect trans kids or protect trans youth. I even have a cute shirt with the protect trans kids written on it in handwriting. This phrase has got me thinking lately, especially because I love thinking about the significance of words. The word protect carries the idea that the person being protected is vulnerable or at risk, or under attack, or could be harmed. The command to protect trans kids suggests that it is adults, or maybe even cisgender adults, who should do the protecting of trans kids. The power dynamic set up between the protector and the protected places the protector as the knowledge holder, the one in control, and the protected places the one in control. Sorry, the protector is the decision maker, who may at times be working with the best interest of those they are protecting, but may not see those in need of protection as agentic or knowledgeable. Protection is also a hope. It is a wish that harm won't be done. The word protection is sometimes also used to suggest ownership, as in we protect property or objects. I'm worried that the language of protection works as a trap because it uses the language of the oppressor. We risk reinforcing the belief that children have no agency. Even though it may come from a place of deep care and advocacy, I'm worried that by using the language of protection, we are making trans youth into objects. Objects are to be protected, and also objects that can't speak, have no agency, and are reliant on adults for safety. There are so many good reasons that we started using the language of protection in response to anti-trans legislation and the violence of discrimination trans people face. We are afraid for trans youth, and with good reason. Protection is a powerful word, and amidst moral panics about the child and transness, it can be strategic to use evocative language. Like Jules Gill-Peterson has written, I really do wish that I could protect trans children from the violence of state power. I want trans kids to have rights. I want justice for trans kids. And for me, centering justice means that adults need to engage with trans kids as knowledgeable, as experts of their own lives, and deserving of a complex personhood. I don't want the goal to be that all children have equal access to innocence, or for them to all be protected. I want justice for trans kids, and I want them to be treated as fully human. Western beliefs about childhood have been shaped by the myth of childhood innocence. This idea of childhood as a time when innocence can be traced to 18th century French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau's theories about childhood were based on the white middle class able-bodied child. Because Rousseau's ideas about childhood are still pervasive today, the white child is still our paradigm of who deserves protection. He believed that children come from God, are born pure and naturally good, and need to be saved from corruption and molded into responsible adults. These romantic era ideas were classist, patriarchal, and important to the construction and maintenance of whiteness. Innocence is not a natural state of being that is accessible to all children, but is a socially constructed category shaped by differentials of power that enables adults, namely those who are white and colonial, to produce themselves as dominant. Innocence was only granted to white middle-class boys and girls. The poor, the disabled, and the racialized were seen as sinful, uncivilized, and requiring discipline. Punishment for a bad child, aka a poor, disabled, or racialized child, serves two functions: to reinforce the division between the good and the bad child, and to attempt to make the bad child good. Both of these functions serve the preservation of white innocence. White supremacist logic attempts to make the idea of whiteness and the idea of innocence not only equivalent, but naturally connected. The construction of white childhood innocence continues to be upheld by theories of development, laws and policies, formal education structures, and media. The construction and maintenance of childhood as a time of innocence is crucial to both adults' power over children and the divide between the child and the adult. Innocence is defined in contrast to the experiences and knowledge that characterize adulthood. And so to protect the child and the innocence of childhood, adults must control their access to knowledge. This divide is challenged when children are seen as knowledgeable and experts of their own lives. The policies of children's identities are determined within the boundaries constructed by adults, and these boundaries are supported by the desire to protect innocence. Innocence implies an oblivion of knowledge, a kind of ignorance that is transferable and protective of the whiteness that is constitutive of it. In this way, childhood innocence is the perfect alibi to violent acts of erasure and the actors who carry them out. The framework of innocence was built on racist and classist beliefs, and so the goal can't be to insist that all children deserve innocence. As my colleague Julie Garland has argued, when we simply expand the age-old refrain, let children be children, to let all children be children, what we are actually saying is let all children be like white children. Because the very notion that childhood is a separation from adulthood is premised on white supremacy. I agree with Garland and her ask that we reconceptualize childhood through the concept of justice. What would it mean to think of childhood as premised on justice rather than innocence? With the increased visibility of trans youth, the media continually renews the belief that young people are a new phenomenon, and as Jules Skills-Peterson has pointed out, this libel about their newness reinforces the power, authority, and knowledge that adults have over children. In the edited collection Trapdoor, Rana Gossett, Eric A. Stanley, and Joanna Burton discuss the politics of visibility to argue that positive representation gives little support or protection to most trans people. Visibility is seen as, quote, the primary path through which trans people might have access to livable lives. And yet these doors to resources, to recognition, and to understanding that are offered to trans people are almost always traps, and that trans bodies' histories and culture are accommodated only insofar as they can be forced to understood through a cisgender, white, heteronormative lens. For me, questions about visibility, representation, and agency always come back to how systems of power, like medical institutions and education, come to determine whose lives are whose lives are livable and breathable. I question the legitimacy of leaving decisions about trans lives to institutional systems because of the ways these systems of power perpetuate marginalization and erasure of racialized, poor, and disabled trans people, and especially children. Young people should have the ability to define their own genders and to name themselves, although systematically speaking, it is adults who currently control these definitions and names. What role does visibility play in protection, and can we call on trans youth to be both visible and to protect them? So I love getting to talk to young trans people about their lives. They are smart, creative, and all deserve what Avery Gordon calls a complex personhood. In research with trans youth, this means not defining them by their gender transition, age, or high rates of discrimination and suicide ideation. Gordon demands that we notice in our reading and research practices the complicated relationships individuals have both to the particularities of their lives and to the social categories we use to make sense of the world. This theoretical framework insists that young people's lives are influenced by issues like gender, sex, race, disability, socioeconomic status, and that in order to support and understand and work with youth, we must recognize the ways economic, social, and political conditions impact young people's lives. Choosing a name is one of the first ways some trans people begin to assume a different gender from the one they were assigned at birth. Because of their age, trans youth's relationship to and negotiation of naming is particularly complex. These young people are often still dependent on the very families who named them. The act of selecting a name separate from the one their parents assigned for them then is central to identity formation, enacting simultaneously the pull back into the home and the push out into the world. In this study, I asked, what does the renaming process reveal about trans youth's relationship with their peers, family, culture, and emerging sense of identity? How do youth take up, rewrite, and refuse new forms of gendered identity? And what can we learn about the work of names from the way trans youth narrate this process? So current trans youth describe them as suffering from high rates of discrimination, bullying, homelessness, suicide ideation, than their gender conforming peers. And while this is important to recognize the challenges trans youth face, these discourses really position them as always at risk and present a really limited framework for understanding their lives and the stories they can tell about their experiences. Research about trans people needs to explore the ways they're using language to render themselves intelligible and how they are resisting victim narratives through the naming and unnaming of who they are or want to become. So the purpose of my study was to solicit rich, nuanced stories about naming from trans youth. The purpose of my study was to solicit nuanced stories about naming from trans youth. I recruited trans youth in Canada, Australia, and Ireland through existing contacts in LGBT centers and used snowball sampling to find more participants. I interviewed 10 to 15 young trans people in each country using an in-depth interview structure, semi-structured life history framework. Each participant chose a pseudonym in the interview or agreed to let me use their name in my data analysis and writing. My research methodology is informed by narrative inquiry, which is aimed at understanding and making meaning of experience and recognizes the co-constructed nature of data. So I'm going to turn now to some of the stories youth shared with me about the importance of names, the ways gender arose in their naming practices, and the joy that comes from choosing a new name. So Ty told me about how it was a really big deal for him to change his name, and most importantly, for people to call him by his name. He said, I mean, for a lot of people, a name is not a big deal. But to me, I know for sure that when my name was changed and people started calling me Ty, that was a huge deal. It meant more than a name. It was more like respect. They respected me enough to respect that I wanted to be called Ty, and that's what I prefer. The pronouns I was used to, the name was the first thing. Recent research supports much of what Ty describes. A study conducted by Stephen Russell and colleagues found that when trans youth are able to use their preferred name, they have a stronger mental health, and by using the chosen name of a trans person, their chance of suicide is reduced by as much as 65%. This seems like such a small practice, but can have such a big impact. In my first interview with Beryl, they began by telling me about how their name reflected both their ties to their culture as Irish and Chinese, and was a name they chose to strategically navigate gender-based violence and discrimination. Although a more feminine name does not reflect their gender identity, Beryl chose what they described as a, quote, traditionally feminine name to provide them less trans visibility and more protection from transphobia. They said the name Beryl is more distinctly feminine, and as a trans person, especially a trans feminine spectrum person, I'm probably going to experience more violence than other people, and I've noticed an increase in violence anyways, and if I'm going to be taken more seriously, I kind of need to have a name. I wasn't going to have a name like Stephanie because that was a bit too feminine for me, and it was too unconnected to my roots anyways. Beryl was well aware of the violence and discrimination that trans women face and strategically chose a name that they hoped would allow them greater recognition as a woman. Trans youth also spoke to me about how they use different names in different contexts. Maybe you do too. Depending on their safety, the way they wanted to be understood, and their relationship to the people in a particular space, trans youth made decisions about what name to use in each space or community they entered. Luca offered an eloquent discussion of this in his interview. Luca says, and I think that names should, not from a logistical point of view, but from a personality kind of point of view, that I think the names are stagnant and too stuck in place. And I think that we should be able to have like 2 or 3 aliases that we want to go by separate things. And I use it to compartmentalize my life. Even before I was trans, I would use different names to compartmentalize my life because my name was really long and it had multiple nicknames. So in church spaces, I would be one name, and in school spaces, I'd be another, and family spaces, I'd be another, and I could kind of keep how I presented myself. Like at church, it was more formal compared to school based on my name, and it was all the same name in the end. And this is not an uncomplicated strategy among the trans youth I spoke with. For some, these multiple names reflected their expression and creativity, and for others, it was about intimacy and relationships. In choosing a name, Palace spoke about their desire to find a name that didn't announce their gender. In response to assumptions people often make about the relationship between gender and names, they wanted a name that wouldn't hint at what theirs is. When I heard, and so this is from Palace. Palace says, when I heard Palace, I was like, that's not a name. That's what I want. I really like the idea of having something that's like not a name, because then there's no already associated gender role. And I think it was so important that nobody had any sort of preconceived ideas about who a palace would be, or what a palace would look like, or act like, or think like, or like what their gender would be, especially written on paper, because they'd be like palace and then have no idea who was going to walk through the door. And I like that. Palace found joy in their creative process of choosing a name that fit their gender. Some people feel trapped in the assumptions that people make about them because of their name, and Palace offers a strategy to escape these gender norms. Research has documented the ways racism functions in the workplace based on people's names, and I think this kind of navigation is kind of similar in some sense. At 15 years old, Chris was the youngest person I talked to. Chris really helped me understand the way temporality functions in narratives about names. Chris thought about his future self as a way to imagine who he wanted to be in the present. Chris said, well, like I have like this really bad habit of thinking like far too ahead. So like I even thought like, what do I want written on my gravestone? This is a little bit far ahead for what I'm thinking about, but okay, let's work with this. So I was just thinking like when I do eventually get married and have a family, what do I want to be known as? What do I want to have like my sister-in-law, brother-in-law, whatever, like what do I want my mother and father-in-law call me? Or like at least what would I be comfortable with? So like it was hard to pick, and like it was hard to sort of narrow it down because I was thinking so far ahead. But like it was just like I could think pretty far ahead, like my death. But like that's a little far ahead. But I did really think it was over, and just like, well, what do I want to be known as later in life? And will I still like this name later in life? Trans youth are often bombarded with messages about how all young trans people are suicidal and depressed. And in the face of this limiting narrative, Chris articulates a plan to live a long life. He imagines the normative future and one in which he will be loved by a partner and have a family that will respect him. Trans youth also told me about how much joy they get from choosing a name and hearing someone use their name to refer to them. Donica really encapsulates this happiness in describing what it's like when someone uses their name. It's fun. I really enjoy it. I love getting that feeling of like, yeah, this is my name. I picked myself. It's, you know, like, so I think it's really nice. I love hearing my name. It gives me a burst of euphoria when someone mentions me by my name, even in passing, or when my friends especially introduces me as Donica. I'm like, yep, that is my name. Thank you. I'm so happy. The trans youth I spoke with, oh my gosh, the trans youth I spoke
Never spoke.
There we go. The trans youth I spoke never spoke about a desire for protection, but they did tell me about the ways they navigate gender discrimination, feel supported by friends and community, and negotiate the complicated ways parents can be both rejecting and accepting. In many ways, trans youth are innocent, but I'm not sure that this innocence needs protection. What seemed clear to me from these interviews is that trans youth wanted to be treated as fully human. They want respect, they want to be listened to, and they want support. They want access to knowledge and services, and they don't want to have to prove their gender or their need for care they want. So in this talk, I've brought together and put into conversation some thoughts from childhood youth studies and trans studies to think about how trans youth are conceptualized and represented in debates about the child. Despite having a genuine desire to protect trans kids, I have worries and questions about what it means to employ this language and all of its connotations in our fight for liberation and justice for young trans people. Trans youth narratives about their naming practices demonstrate their agency, creativity, and the strategic ways they navigate cisnormativity and transphobia. Trans kids deserve justice. They should be treated with dignity and humanity, just like all trans people. Thanks.